I was actually going to say that this presentation comes with a disclaimer in the sense that I'm a professor, but I'm also a lawyer by training. And when talking about policy making, lawyers have sort of a professional deformation about wanting to be very normative. And so you can definitely know in the Socrates debate where I sort of stand, or where I was standing before. I've been working on this issue of genetic discrimination for almost 2 decades now, and I have to say my perspective changed a lot. When I started, I definitely wanted to be normative, and I have plenty of good ideas of what people should be doing. And 2 decades later, I actually know more about what people should be doing. And I'm less popular at talk for that reason, for some reason. So I'll present you, the challenges and the concerns that I have around that issues and the difficulties that I've tackled. I'm not an expert on risk theory, risk communication, but I'm certainly very interested in this area, and we've definitely come to a point where it's something we know we need to address if we want to have interesting strategies to move forward on this particular topic. Okay, so a few words about genetic. My God, genetics really complicated, and I think that's one of the reasons why it's really difficult to achieve the right balance between information, perception. It's been very much hyped. So you see, we don't talk about genetic, we talk about the genetic revolution. And there's been buzzwords, that have come across the years. Right now we're talking about precision medicine, personalized medicine, and there's a lot of hype about how it's going to change medical practice in the near future. The reality of it is that genetics certainly has a huge potential. But that a lot of it is riddled with uncertainty. What it has accomplished so far has been more modest. There's a few diseases that are monogenic, meaning one gene associated with one disease, and that are that also bears high susceptibilities, meaning if you have that gene, you're very likely to develop that disease. But that's not the general model. Most diseases are much more complicated. And we don't really yet know what the correlation is and what are the causes. So there's still a lot to learn, and how much genetic will contribute to that versus environment and sheer luck is still very much uncertain. Even though the technology, now we can sequence the whole genome. So the technology has advanced at a tremendous pace. And so that's sort of where we stand on the genetic revolution. Great potential, but lots of uncertainty on exactly how that's going to materialize in the clinical setting. Now that genetic, especially I would say in the 1980s, when we were really in the monogenic sort of genetic disease model, has given birth to a concept in social sciences that we call genetic exceptionalism. And that was a typical, I suspect a lawyer must have invented that, but that's the idea basically, that genetic information is different from other types of medical information, and that therefore needs to be protected more. And so it needs to be singled out in policies. So that's the concept of genetic exceptionalism, and the debate is still raging as to whether this is a good idea or not. Of course, genetic information is very rich. It's very easy to capture, put on the internet, has some predictive value. It's extremely complex to interpret. But a lot of other medical information also share those qualities, which is sort of hard, which is why it's kind of hard to make a final judgment on whether this is the way to go or not. And at the same time, there has been definitely a lot of genetic essentialism, and also we've heard the word geneticization. That's been done both by scientists and I would say in the media as well, where very often people have attempted to explain everything by genetic, even though, the picture is way more complex. So meaning, because you have this gene, we found that this gene is correlated with Alzheimer's disease. Well, the picture is much more complex than that. Just because you have a certain type of genetic profile, it certainly doesn't mean you're going to develop Alzheimer. And if it does, maybe you'll develop it at 50 or maybe at 70. So there's a lot of probabilities associated with that. And as we know, people have trouble dealing with probabilities. So that's why I think we sort of revert to that picture of, well, it's all genetic. And therefore it can explain everything. And there's still too much of that. I mean, it's gotten better. I think scientists especially are more sensitive of their discourse. But there's still a bit of that. So now let's talk about personal insurance a bit. Insurance is a great, again, it's a great concept if you want to discuss about risk, because insurance is all about risk. We're going to focus on life insurance. It's a private contract. It's contrarily to, for example, the United States, we have public health care, but if we want life insurance, we have to buy it through the private sector. And of course, for there to be a possibility to insure yourself, for insurance to work, there has to be an uncertain event that you're going to insure. It's a lot like lottery if you think about it. So basically, you're betting that, the time of your death, if you die at an earlier time than the average people, you'll get, the money at an earlier time. And if you die at a later time, then other people will benefit from your contribution, because we're talking in the concept of mutuality, where several people contribute to an insurance pool. So the uncertainty in life insurance is the time of your death. Everybody dies, but we don't know exactly at what age we're going to die. I talked about mutuality. There's also a concept of utmost good faith. If you want to be insured, because you know more about your health than your insurer does, you're expected to share everything that's health relevant with your insurer, and that's by law in Canada. The current position of the Insurance Association, which is sort of supported by law, is that they won't impose a genetic test on you if you're trying to purchase a life insurance, but if you or your doctor are aware of genetic test results, or results of tests that you would have passed, whether in a clinical setting or in the research context, if the insurer or if you or your doctors are aware of it, the insurer expect that you are going to reveal these results. Now, where does this debate on genetic discrimination come from? For some reason, it's been highly mediatized. The media has built a lot of story around, I would say, incidental evidence. If you look at the media portrayal, it's almost always the same conditions that the people have that are saying they've been discriminated against. It's usually monogenic, highly familial disease. So for example, Huntington's the perfect example of that. There's been a couple on also breast cancer, people that have the BRCA1 or 2 genes, but outside of that, there's been very little that's been discussed in the newspaper. So the genetic discrimination evidence as it is portrayed in the newspaper, and it's one of the topic when you talk about genetic and you want to make it to the front page, or be invited at radio show, things like that. For some reason, genetic discrimination always hits the mark. And also, what's been very interesting is that regardless of evidence, the surveys have always sort of found that people were very worried about genetic discrimination. And in fact, the latest one in Canada was in 2014, and it found that at least 7 in 10 Canadians are somewhat or very concerned about the use of genetic testing results for non-health related purposes. And what's even more interesting is that they're more worried about privacy breach following genetic testing than from wearable health services. And that was a surprise for me being interested in both sort of topics, because I would say, and as a privacy specialist, that there's probably a lot more reason to be worried about the second one. So this is the context, and I should add on privacy that also a lot of individuals have mentioned that they would be reluctant to participate in genetic research or undergo clinical genetic testing because of worries related to genetic discrimination. The legislative response has been intense, to say the least, especially in Europe. We've seen, I would say, a good 15 to 20 European countries, most European countries, I would say, have adopted some sorts of legislation or moratoria on the use of genetic tests by insurers. In the United States also, they've adopted a law, and even in Asia, the debate is now there, and there's a few countries that have also adopted laws. So intense legislative activity, not really sure that this has changed anything on people's perception. This is some work that I did in 2013. I wanted to look at, well, you know, what's the evidence of genetic discrimination actually? And so, I mean, the results weren't really that surprising. So the methodology of the survey, so what I did was a systematic review of the evidence. I looked at all the papers that had been published on genetic discrimination that were studies, and compared the result to try to reach some sort of meta-conclusion. And so the methodology of the surveys we looked at, most of them were lacking rigor and consistency. Out of maybe 50 studies that we looked at, there might have been half a dozen which I would have considered robust studies. You know, for example, the information, so when people were saying that they had been discriminated against, that information wasn't verified. It was sort of taken as granted that that person had been in fact discriminated against. While there's some evidence that most of the time people don't really understand if they're refused by an insurance company, why they are refused by the insurance company, or why was their premium higher priced. So that's an example. Small scale studies, the way people were recruited also would sometimes also put in some bias into the study. So, but anyhow, the analysis of all the available study made me come to the conclusion that there was clear evidence of discrimination for only a very small number of classic conditions. I mentioned BRCA and Huntington, and that's about the only two where there was Huntington, there's solid evidence of genetic discrimination. BRCA, it's much more modest. Outside of that, there's really very little. And all you can sort of you know, think is that it might be, you know, one occasional error by the insurance industry, but there's certainly no widespread discrimination outside of those two conditions. And I call them classic condition because they're really, you know, old sort of genetic disease that we've discovered the genetic, you know, factors in the disease a long time ago, 30 years ago. Or 20 years in the case of BRCA. So it's not new. The new genetic research, there's absolutely no evidence that there's been, for example, following whole genome sequencing of an individual, that person's been discriminated, things like that. Absolutely no evidence at the current time. So what has been, you know, really happening? Well, in the United States, I mentioned they adopted a law. It's called GINA. They adopted it in 2008, and that was sort of a signal in Canada that really, you know, policymakers and pressure groups, and I should say, when I say pressure group, that the Huntington's disease patient association has been the most active one, have really sort of taken this adoption of GINA, which is the Genetic and Non-Discrimination Act in the United States, as a signal of even the United States are doing something about it, therefore we should do something about it. And that has been sort of brought back to the forefront because of GINA. What's interesting to say for the little history is that GINA is actually doesn't apply to life insurance at all. It was a bill that had, the idea was to secure health insurance for Americans who didn't have health insurance. So it was really about genetic discrimination in the health field. In the US, there's nothing preventing genetic discrimination in life insurance. And so several bills were put in front of the Canadian Senate. The one that has the most chance to pass at the current time is called S201, which is a bill to prohibit and prevent genetic discrimination. It's the second time it's presented to the Senate. The first time around, it was very broad, very far-reaching, and non-constitutional. So for that reason, it ended up being pushed back and being cut drastically. This second attempt at presenting the bill, it's a much more modest bill that would have extremely limited impact in terms of prohibitive, law. The only thing it would prevent mostly is genetic discrimination in federal employment sector. So it's really limited because insurance is a provincial field. So it's out of the reach of the federal legislator. So, what can we see about this? I'm a big old movie buff, and this is a really famous, the first modern vampire movie by Murnau. And what's really interesting about this movie is that, most of the people, and the movie's not remembered for the vampire himself. It's remembered for that very famous scene where you actually see the shadow of the vampire. And I think that there's a lot of that with genetic discrimination. It's not really about discrimination itself, it's about the possibility that it could have, and about the anxiety over that in particular. So thank you for your attention.
Good, thank you.